Okay, brothers and sisters, good evening again. It's a privilege, a joy to be back with you. And I have to thank you all for joining me for so long. This has been a long series, and we have after this at least a couple more to go. And I'm thanking you because this is a very difficult book, and my goal was never to draw you into this because it's so sensational and you get hyped up and so on. My goal is to go the opposite direction, to help you understand the message of the book, because that is so important. What is the overall message? And you can, track from message to message the direction of where we're going. And we began at the very start with pointing out that this book is about Christ. It's about the triumph of the Lamb who was slain. And you will see that suffering is a part of this message, a deep part of the suffering, because we are associated with the Lamb who was slain and we follow the Lamb. So this is the thrust. I know for so many years, and I have been part of it too, following a lot of people who get people hyped up and use this as sales pitch for Book of Revelation, as sales pitch for, a lot of things that's not there in the book itself. And I'm sure as you're going through, you're seeing for yourself a lot of things that you have not seen before. So that has been my goal. All right, so I appreciate you sticking with us in this study. So now tonight we are on lesson 11, and we're going to be focusing on chapter 17 and 18. I refer to this as final judgment of the Babylonian world system of the beast. Now that's a long title, and you're probably familiar with, the language of Babylon, world system, beast, and so on. I am pulling all of these together in one caption because they all relate together and part of the final judgment. So you will see a couple of places in these chapters, chapter 18 in particular, the expression, woe, woe, O great city. Maybe it's a little different in your translation, but at chapter 18, 16 and 17, there's this great woe. And the woe is this language of final judgment. It's very dire. And the question is, what is this, this beast, this Babylonian system that we were introduced to as early as chapter 16? And it was pronounced as a fallen Babylon. What is this? What is this about? So this is what we want to look into tonight. So let me quickly bring us up to speed to where we are in chapter 18. We saw in chapter 16 that last week that the final judgment has finally arrived in chapter 16. And you'll see that especially in the last two bowl judgments. The final bowl judgments represent the actual final judgment. And but we saw before that the final judgment was anticipated from chapter 10, verses 6 to 7, where that mighty angel who had his feet, one on the land and one on the sea. You remember that mighty angel, whom we actually identify as none other than the Lord Jesus Christ. And he expresses his sovereignty over the whole creation by claiming land and sea, universal sovereignty, because he's exalted to the throne. But he announced in chapter 10:6 by swearing that there will be no more time, there will be no more delay, time will be ended shortly. But then in verse 7 it says, but in the days when the seventh angel sound, or is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be complete. That's language of final judgment. God's program of judgment and salvation for the world will be completed. The Lord Jesus tells us in that early vision, when the last angel poured out his judgment. Okay, so all along we're seeing the anticipation of final judgment, but chapter 16 we arrive at the final judgment. But even more, we can even go back even further. The anticipation of final judgment, you will remember, goes back to actually chapter 6, where in verses 10 and 11, where the fifth seal was broken. What happens? We see the slain believers, the martyrs under the altar crying out that God will avenge their blood from their persecutors. And then right after that, at the sixth seal, it was the fifth seal that they cry out for vengeance. The sixth seal, we see a picture of the final judgment, you remember, where all the islands and the mountains were moved out of place and so on. And the great mighty men of the earth were crying out to the rocks and to the mountains, fall on us, because the great day of his wrath has come, and so on. So tracking this is so important, because it helps us to get a grip of what the message is about. Again, it is not about Israel in a final tribulation to come. It is the saints who are mortal already, who are crying to God in heaven under the altar as they await their final resurrection and glorification. They cry out to God for vengeance. The blood of the righteous, by the way, always cries out for vengeance. When the righteous are persecuted, you remember the blood of Abel cried out for vengeance to God. And so it is right through the ages. God's people were persecuted. They longed for God to avenge them of their persecutors. So it began early there. And then we see the final judgment, which is promised, so to speak, in the sixth seal, that it was there. Only there at the final judgment will the saints be vindicated. They are told to wait until that moment. You remember chapter 10, the Lord Jesus tells us in that vision that when the final angel poured out his wrath, the saints will have their vindication. That will be the last judgment. So then this anticipation shows a longing for the saints for vindication. God is telling us to wait. And that's the way we feel, don't we? When we suffer and when we feel oppressed and are persecuted and taken advantage of in this world. That's how we feel. And so we come to 16:17 and we read, it is done, which means we're at the point of final judgment. It is done signals the end. God, it reminds us that God does hear the cry of his people. That's the point. God remembers the cry, the anguish, the pain, just like he did with the Israelites in Egypt. And he brought judgment in the plagues of Egypt. The plagues of Egypt foreshadow. They look forward to these final plagues when God will judge the wicked system of the nations for persecuting his saints. So what the final judgment entails, you remember we said, it entails a brief, very brief period at the very end of history. And we see this in the 6th and 7th bowls. If you notice the 6 and 7 bowls, which represents a final judgment, it's very short description, right? Very, very short description. In fact, the final angel poured out in chapter 16:17, poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple, you remember, from the throne saying, it is done. And then there were flashes of lightning and so on. So it's a very brief, general sort of apocalyptic description of the final judgment. But the imagery that we read in chapter 16-18 is very powerful. It's the imagery of final judgment. Look at verse 18. Then there were flashes of lightning, roaring, and crashes of thunder. And there was a tremendous earthquake, an earthquake unequal since humanity has been on the earth. So tremendous was this earthquake. That imagery is the imagery of final judgment. That's how God describes both in the Old Testament and even here in the Apocalypse and elsewhere in the New Testament. You see this kind of language. It is final judgment language. It signals cosmic destruction. It's not limited to various parts of the world, but it's universal. It's cosmic. It engulfs the whole world. This destruction, cosmic destruction, is explained in verse 19. Look at verse 19, chapter 16. The great city was split in 3 parts, and the cities of the nations, you see it's universal, collapsed. And then we have introduced to us here Babylon. So Babylon the Great was remembered before God and was given the cup filled with the wine made from God's furious wrath. And you see that verse 20 now. Every island fled away and no mountain could be found. Takes you back to chapter 6 and verse 10, the same description. So all of this is final judgment, but it's very short. It's very cryptic. It's very cosmic in its extent, and it's very frightening. The destruction is explained in 16-19 in terms of Babylon. That's right. The destruction that we read of from the great earthquake of chapter 18 is described in terms of the fall and the destruction of Babylon. The great city was split into 3 parts. This is all figurative language. The cities of the nations collapsed. It's universal destruction. And what? Babylon was remembered before God. Remembered. In the Bible, the language of remembrance is very powerful. God remembers his people. And when he remembers his people, he remembers his people for good. But when he remembers the pagan world, it's not good. He remembers them for judgment. This is what we see here. He remembers Babylon. So the destruction is explained in terms of Babylon, this cosmic destruction. The destruction is portrayed as God's answer to the saints' prayer in chapter 7, verse 6. Sorry, that reference is, sorry, I got it wrong here. The destruction is explained as God's answer to the saints' prayer. Look at, let me show you chapter 17, verse 6. That's where I should take you. In 17:6, when Babylon's fall is starting to be described, we're told that Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the detestable things of the earth, is the Babylon we're talking about here. We're going to look at that later on. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of those who testified to Jesus. Okay, so this verse tells us that the blood of the saints was the same blood described earlier on in chapter 6. So that the destruction of Babylon we're going to deal with now is really an answer to the prayers of the saints, chapter 6, which tells us again that this is a final judgment. The final judgment will be the vindication of the saints, that they're God's true people, even though they are persecuted by the system of the world. Okay, so all of this is important to bring us up to speed to taking on the challenge of chapter 17 and 18. Now, chapters 17 and 18, remember we just noted that the end of chapter 16 takes us up to the final judgment, the last two bowls, but it's very short, very cryptic, and needing a lot of explanation and unpacking. So now, chapter 17 and 18 is a further elaboration of the 6th and 7th bowl. The chapters further interpret the final judgment of the 6th and the 7th bowls, which announce the judgment of Babylon. So in the 7th bowl judgment, the judgment of Babylon is announced. Now, in chapter 17 and 18, we will have further explanation, elaboration, expansion of what this judgment is. We will need to define who Babylon is, what is Babylon, and why he's being judged. So this is where chapter 17 and 18 takes us. The angel who reveals and interprets the vision of chapter 17 is one of the 7 angels with the 7 bowls of the last judgment. Remember that when the bowl judgments were announced, there were 7 angels with 7 bowls, right? So in the description of the judgment of Babylon in chapter 17, verse 1, we're told that one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke to me, John. Okay? And the angel said, "Come, I will show you the condemnation and the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters." All right? So the announcement of judgment of Babylon the Great in chapter 16-19 is now brought to focus in chapter 17 and later on in chapter 18. But now one of the same angels who had the 7 bowls, he took John to show John what? The condemnation and the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. All right, who is that great prostitute? We shall see later on as we advance in this chapter. So why is this important that one of the angels of the 7 bowls should take John and explain and interpret for him this next vision? This indicates that chapter 17 is really an amplification, an extension, an expansion, if you prefer, of the 6th and the 7th bowls, so that chapter 17 is a further expansion of the final judgment, a further description of the final judgment. What is going to happen in the final judgment? That's the point. That the angel had to provide interpretation, because we shall see later on, the angel will interpret this vision, shows the highly symbolic nature of this vision, right? There's a lot of symbolism in this vision. Even with the angel's interpretation, there is going to be need for further unpacking of the symbolisms, because some of the explanations of the angels are done by providing more symbols to the symbols that are already existing. All right, which means we who now read the Bible needs to unpack these symbols. All right, so let's move one step further. Now, let me point out, in fact, I should read chapter 17 at this point. So let me go ahead and read it, because a lot of what is to come will miss you if we don't have this preview of the chapter. So let me pick up verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls came and spoke to me. Come, he said, I will show you the condemnation and punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality, and the earth's inhabitants got drunk with the wine of her immorality. So he carried me away in the spirit. You know, this is visionary. It's not literally being there. This is visionary. The angel carried me away in the spirit to a wilderness, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Do you remember another woman in Revelation connected to a wilderness? We'll talk about that a little more, but think about that. So he carried me away in the spirit to a wilderness, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet clothing, and adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held in her hand a golden cup filled with detestable things and unclean things, abominable things from her sexual immorality. In other words, the abominable things are derived from her committing sexual immorality with her partners. Again, this is figurative. We're going to unpack that. Okay? On her forehead was written a name: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of detestable things of the earth. This is graphic, powerful, dark language. The language here, the description is pretty dark of Babylon. Who is this woman? I saw that the woman was drunk with what? With the blood of the saints and the blood of those who testified to Christ. So the woman is drunk. She's responsible. A lot of blood on her hands, so to speak, for persecuting God's people. John says, I was greatly astounded when I saw her. But the angel said to me, why are you astounded? I will interpret for you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast you saw was and is not, but is about to come up from the abyss, and then to go to destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, all those whose names have not been written in the book of life since the foundation of the world, will be astounded when they see that the beast was and is not, but is to come. This requires a mind that has wisdom. This is John's language of saying those who read and understand this require discernment. Discernment. The 7 heads, the angel begins to interpret. The 7 heads are 7 mountains the woman sits on. But how does that help you? What are the 7 mountains? There are also 7 kings. Who are the 7 kings? 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But whenever he does come, he must remain for only a brief time. The beast that was and is not is himself an 8th king, and yet is one of the 7 and is going to destruction. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received the kingdom, but will receive full authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These kings have a single intent, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war with the Lamb, but the Lamb will conquer them. See the conquest of the Lamb? Because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. He is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those accompanying the Lamb are called chosen and faithful. Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw, second part of the interpretation, is the waters. The woman is sitting on the waters. Where the prostitute is seated are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So clearly, we have a clear understanding of what the waters are. The woman is sitting upon the waters. The waters are the people, the nations, the multitudes, the languages. The 10 horns that you saw and the beast, these will hate the prostitute and make her desolate and naked. Look, this prostitute, this woman was riding the beast, right? She sits on the beast. But now the beast is gonna what? Persecute her and kill her, make her desolate and naked. They will consume her flesh and burn her up with fire. Why? For God has put in their minds to carry out his purpose by making a decision to give their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So, what is going on here? A lot of unpacking to do. Now, a third part of the interpretation, verse 18. As for the woman you saw, she is the great city. Remember we see the great city earlier, chapter 16, verse 19. So Babylon the Great was remembered before God. Okay? And in verse 17:5, on her forehead was written a name, a mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes. So what is going on here? Chapter 17-18 says, as for the woman you saw, she is a great city that has sovereignty over the kings of the earth. Now, this will require about 4 sessions to really unpack these imageries, really. And this is one of the most difficult part in the book because it is so dense with imageries. And we'll have to be very steep in the Old Testament to kind of unpack this. I'm going to summarize basically what's going on in these chapters. So by the time we get to end, we have a good picture of the message that is being conveyed in these 2 chapters. All right, so notice the key focus of chapters 17 and 18 is found in verse 1. Look at verse 1. John is invited to come and see this vision. And what is the purpose for John seeing this vision? The angel wanted to show John the condemnation, the punishment, the judgment, the destruction of this great prostitute who sits on many waters. This is the main point of the chapters. Babylon, in the final judgment, is the object of God's destruction. Don't forget that. It is the object of God's destruction. For this ungodly system, this system is God's major opponent. We'll unpack that a little more. This is what the angel invited John to see in the first verse. All right? But there's a main problem. Demonstrating the identity of Babylon the Great is very difficult. The this is the main problem. Babylon is depicted as a prostitute, as a woman. Who is she? She is referred to as a great prostitute who sits on many waters. And in verse 4, chapter 17, she is the woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Okay? Now, I want you to think for a moment. There are two women, important women in Revelation, symbolically speaking. The first one is in chapter 12. And you remember, we identified that woman in chapter 12 as the covenant people of God, the church in our times. But the woman in chapter 12 represents God's people throughout the ages. In our time of the church, chapter 12 represents, the woman in chapter 12 represents a church. And we saw that in chapter 12, what? The dragon, what? Persecutes the woman, the church. Who is the dragon, you remember? Satan, the serpent. He persecutes the church. But in chapter 12, it looks like a direct persecution of the church. Now, we know now in chapter 17 and 18 that the persecution of the woman, the church, comes through Satan's agents, and described more fully in chapter 17 and 18. And this is why God's judgment is falling upon this other woman, right? Because this woman is Satan's agent. Okay? So this is kind of what's going on here. Okay, so Babylon is depicted as a prostitute, as a woman, unlike the virgin woman of chapter 12, which is a church, this portrayed in purity and holiness and so on as God's chosen people. And this is really in contrast to the woman of chapter 17 and 18. All right, there are two views. I want to point this out. Typically two views, broadly speaking, of this woman, this figurative Babylonian woman. The first view is called the literal view of chapter 17 and 18. Those people who take this as a literal reading of the chapter, they explain that in the Old Testament, Babylon was the empire of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar prosecuted the Old Testament people of God. You remember that? They were drawn into exile and massacred and slaughtered, the temple destroyed. Babylon took Israel into exile for 70 years. But in Isaiah and Jeremiah, God promised the absolute obliteration of Babylon, is destruction because of what Babylon did to Israel. Now, those who take this literal view of Revelation 17 and 18 will explain to you that that promise in the Old Testament was not fulfilled. And so God still has a final day when Babylon, the Babylon of the Old Testament, will be fulfilled. How is that possible though? Because there's no more Babylon available today. So how is this explained? They explain that modern Iraq under Saddam Hussein is the Babylon of the end times that God will destroy. Well, that actually makes no sense. In fact, there was a professor at Dallas Seminary who wrote a book on it to defend this view that modern Iraq is the end times Babylon. Of course, that has been debunked many times over. And I have a book in my hand, which I cannot show you clearly, but if you could see on the screen, this is the book written by two New Testament scholars, very fine scholars, who clearly argue that the literal view is not feasible. And one of the main reasons for this is this. If you ever saw this argument, that, and many evangelicals preach this today in America, but if you see this view, just remember this: the people of modern Iraq are not the same ethnic people of ancient Babylon under Saddam Hussein. So that completely ruins the argument, okay? Essentially, the Babylonian ethnic people who were Chaldeans, they were called Chaldeans, under Nebuchadnezzar. Those people have either been completely obliterated, not only by the Medes and the Persians who came after and destroyed Babylon, but in their dispersing among the other nations and ongoing conflicts, they have been almost completely obliterated. Whatever is left of them, they have been assimilated into the nations all over. So they are barely traceable. Modern Iraq is a different ethnic groups of Arabs and so on. Okay, all right. So that argument demolishes that. But clearly, what is going on in Revelation 17 is a figurative view. It takes the language of the Old Testament. You remember we talk about that. Taking the language of the Old Testament to explain what's going on in the present time. Because Babylon came to represent the system of oppression against God's people spiritually. Okay? So the figurative view, understand Babylon as an evil world system. And that's the view we're going to explore here. The conclusion is that the figurative view seems much more feasible, both in the context of Revelation. Revelation is packed with symbolism right through and through, as I've been pointing out. And this is the genre of apocalyptic, which is characterized by symbolism, cryptic, bizarre symbols. A woman riding a beast, that kind of stuff, a beast with 7 heads, 10 horns, that's apocalyptic. Okay? Apocalyptic language. The fact that the angel of the vision had to provide explanation means it cannot be taken literally. Okay? So, let's see if we can provide a clearer picture of who Babylon is by definition. Since Babylon is, portrayed as a prostitute in the Old Testament, prostitution, and a lot of people read the Old Testament, especially the latter part of the Old Testament. A lot of people read the language of the Old Testament about prostitution quite wrongly. The literal practice of prostitution in the Old Testament is very often taken to provide an explanation of Israel and the nation's spiritual prostitution, which is really idolatry. So when Israel, for instance, practice collaboration with the nations and worship their gods, in the Old Testament prophets, it is very often referred to as prostitution, spiritual prostitution. Why? Because Israel is the bride of Jehovah. It's the wife of Jehovah. So Israel has a relationship spiritually with God. They're a covenant bride of Yahweh. So when Israel worships the gods of the nations, it is committing spiritual adultery. She is prostituting herself. She is selling herself like a prostitute to gain the prosperity from the nations. The worship of Baal was about money. It was about economy. To worship Baal is to seek the wealth that the nations offer for participating in worshiping their gods. Okay, Jeremiah portrays this very powerfully. So when Revelation picks up on the language of prostitution, is speaking of spiritual prostitution here. So the Babylonian system is a great prostitute that offers her service to the people of God for profit. It is very seductive. That is what is going on here. The Babylonian system is the evil satanic world system that stands in opposition to God and his people, just as how ancient Babylonia opposes God's people. Its roots goes back to the rebellious opposition at Babel. Babel was the first seminal embryonic stage of the development of the Babylonian system, which becomes the evil opposition against God. There at Babel, the world rebelled against God, you remember, and that become a sort of a paradigm for human institutions and governments rebelling against God. Babylon epitomizes this later on against Israel. Babylon was destroyed, never to rise again, and its ethnic people descendants almost completely decimated. The ethnic people today in Iraq are not the same, as we mentioned, but Babylon came to represent the evil, ungodly world power that opposes God. You must remember this when you read these chapters in Revelation. So Babylon came to represent the evil, ungodly world power that opposes God. And this involves several things. It involves the ungodly social, political, economic system. It is a cultural, pseudo-religious, media, educational system into which the world, the entire world is cultured. It's an organized, well set up, manufactured system coming out of Babel right throughout the centuries, developing into our times, that opposes God. I am afraid that the church today is so unaware of this. This satanic system is manipulated and controlled by Satan and is seductive and delusional. People are deluded by the system. It has a delusional grasp and power upon people. It is cosmic, meaning it's universal, at the center of which is the power of the state. Let me repeat this. At the center of this cosmic, satanically manipulated and controlled, seductive, delusional system is the state. This is something that has been lost on the church in the West. It has been lost on the church today, especially in the West, because we become so easily seduced by the world powers and the system. We actually work and cooperate with the system in a substantial way. In the first century, this system was dominated by Rome, because in the first century, Rome was the great world power, as America is today, as Babylon has been in the past, as the many, many world empires have been in the past. Babylon, at that time when the New Testament was written, was that state at the center of power. It was It was in the first century, I should say, it was dominated by Rome, and Rome was referred to as Babylon. Did you know that? When John sent this book of Revelation to the churches in Asia Minor, they would have understood that in cryptic language, Rome was being described as the power at the center of this ungodly system. That is right. Rome was referred to as the city on 7 hills, right? In Revelation, Rome and the entire succession of the wicked world that follows, the wicked system that follows, take the symbolic name Babylon the Great. So who is Babylon the Great? It is this cosmic, seductive, ungodly, satanically controlled world system that has been perpetuated for centuries into our time, that takes the symbolic name Babylon the Great. Is Babylon the Great present today? Absolutely. It is not Iraq, as some claim. It is the world system that is under judgment. It is huge, and this is at the center of God's judgment, the final judgment. Symbolizing Babylon as a whore, as a prostitute, indicates her alluring and seductive nature to draw the people of God and people in general away from Christ, says New Testament scholar G.K. Beale. Her sitting shows how she is able to control the multitudes and the beast because of her influence. In chapter 18, verse 7, the woman, this seductive woman, boasts by saying, I sit as queen, I cannot be taken down. Right? So, the fact that she's sitting expresses her sovereignty over the nations and over the beast. How is that possible? She is sovereign over the beast and the mass of humanity. Let me read a quotation from Dr. Beale that I just quoted already, explaining this system. This is what he says about this whole system. The whole of chapter 17 and chapters 18 as well represents these religious economic aspects of society, which often worked in conjunction with the political state. The Babylonian whore is generally modeled after literal prostitutes who offered sexual services for money, and particularly after whore-like Israel, who worship idols, meaning that using the language of fornication for economic gain. Now listen to this very carefully. Any institution or facet should be facet of culture that is characterized by pride, like Babel, economic overabundance, persecution, and idolatry is part of this Babylonian system, says Dr. Beale, and that's correct. So how do we identify this evil world system in our time? Now, quickly, let me point out, John was summoned to witness the judgment of this world's idolatrous economic system. Let me put this together like this. The woman riding the beast represents the seduction of money, the economic pseudo-religious system, and the pseudo-religious system of government. You know, I was watching, I don't have time to tell this, I was watching part of the ceremonies that were being performed in Britain with the Queen's passing And I couldn't help but imagine or feel the power of the ceremony of government. We like to think that government is all politics. Government is a mixture of politics, and there's a religious element to it, which is mixed with the economic system. That's right. That is why government have ceremonies, and nobody does these ceremonies as powerful as the British people. And that was highlighted in one of the commentators that I was listening to today. And I believe it was a female commentator who says that nobody does this ceremonial part of this system better than the House of Windsor, which is where the Queen belongs, and that is true. Religion is part of the mixture of this political system. And then, you bring in the Western nations the mixture of Christianity in much of this. And you see how easy it is to seduce. So it has both a pseudo-religious, economic section that attracts people and seduce people, along with the political side of it, the political military side of things. So this is what is going on. You have the woman sitting, and she, who is the economic, semi-pseudo-religious part of things, controls everything. Money is king, right? Money is God. And so the political system depends on that. She is sovereign over it. So John is summoned in verses 1 to 3. I'm summarizing now the sections. John is summoned to witness the judgment of this idolatrous system. Brothers and sisters, let me remind you, as much as and I'm from the old British world where we celebrate all of these fancier, like the British people in the colonies, right? I'm part of that world, and many of you are part of that world too. Okay. Let me remind you that this whole system is under God's judgment, and it will finally fall. That is why Babylon is referred to as fallen, fallen. Babylon the Great is fallen. It cannot be rescued. John is frightened. Did you notice that? By the magnificent appearance of the hostile economic, religious, political system in alliance with the state. John was frightened. He was astounded. I was greatly astounded, he said, when I saw her. When I saw the pomp and the grandeur of what is happening in Britain, even right now, it is magnificent. It is powerful. It is very attractive. I can see why people worship the system, pledging allegiance to the system. It's very powerful. John was frightened when his eyes were opened and he saw what it entails. That's right. The angel volunteered to interpret the vision, and we have the interpretation of the beast in the first, from verses 48 through 14. And basically what this interpretation of the beast is shown is this. This interpretation reveals the deceptive character of the satanic state and its allies, and that it will be revealed as a sham when they are judged by Christ at the end of time. So this is essentially what the angel does to interpret who the beast is. And the angel interprets the beast first, and then it will interpret the waters later on. Okay? And they, of course, we know already from the final judgment of the seven bowl that Babylon is already destroyed. We're told already it is destroyed. Now we're just seeing the full description of it. So the interpretation of the woman is seen in verses 15 and 18. Now look at verse 15. On her forehead, sorry, let me make sure. No, that's verse 5. Verse 15. Then the angel said to me, I have my verses mixed up here a bit. Give me a minute. The interpretation of the woman comes at verses 15 through 18. Okay, so let's do the woman here. Okay, my notes have the woman, but in the Bible, it's the, sorry, it's the waters. Let's do the waters. The interpretation of the waters in verse 15. The waters are what? The peoples, the multitudes, the nations, the language. So we pointed out already, the woman sit as king over all the nations by this economic system. The world essentially is controlled by a central banking system, and that is part of the economic control of the nations that the woman represents here. The interpretation reveals that at the end of history, God will inspire the state and his allies to turn against the economic religious system in order to remove the security. Now, look at what verse 16 says. Then, sorry, the 10 horns that you saw and the beast, these will hate the prostitute. So the beast himself and the kingdom of the beast will turn against the prostitute, who's the economic system. These will hate the prostitute and make her desolate and naked. They will consume her flesh and burn her up with fire. They're going to destroy the economic system. Incidentally, you see this over and over played out in history, where political decisions and political powers seek to overthrow sound fiscal and economic policies. And we're told here that God puts it into the kingdom of the beast to what? To overturn the economic system. And in the end, this is going to go full blown. They will consume her flesh. They will burn her up. Why? For God has put it into their minds. God controls even the beast and his kingdom, right? He is the ultimate sovereign. And God has put it in their minds to carry out his purpose. God is going to destroy the worship of the economic, religious, pseudo-religious system. So God has put it in their minds to carry out his purpose, not the purpose of the beast. They think they're carrying out their purpose by making a decision to give the royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So all the nations will give their power to the beast. The beast will turn against, by wanting to control the economic system, turn against the woman, and everything will collapse. You thought the economic collapse we had, what, 15 years ago was big? We haven't seen anything. In the final judgment, there'll be a total run on the bank. There'll be a collapse of the economic system, and the end would have been upon us. That God destroyed the economic religious system first shows the heart of the problem of the world system. What is the heart of the problem of the world system? It is money. The world system is at heart idolatrous because people worship money, wealth that gives them power. Political power is driven by wealth. If you don't have economic power, political power cannot survive. So what? The world system, brothers and sisters, it's turning in on itself by God's supervision to destroy it. It is God's judgment. All right, I know I have to hurry, but there's a lot to follow. So look at verse. I'm going to go to let me back up here 1 minute. Announcement of judgment on Babylon because of its idolatrous seduction is of God's people is described in 18:1-3. After these things, I saw another angel who possessed great authority coming down from heaven, and the earth was was lit up with radiance. He shouted in a powerful voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a lair of demons, a haunt of every unclean spirit, a haunt of unclean birds, a haunt of every unclean and detestable beast." Do you see that? Do you see that? That's very powerful. And look at verse 3. For all the nations are fallen from the wine of our immoral passion. All the nations are seduced, and the seduction is demonic. You see that description in verse 2. Babylon is fallen. She has become the lair, the hideout of demons. The world system, the monetary, religious, political system is the haunt of demons. It's demonically inspired. Brothers and sisters, we need to understand this. That's not the picture we get when we look at the world around us and the portrayal by the powers that be. And all the nations have fallen. Why? Because of the seduction, the immoral passion, which speaks of the demonic seduction of the nations into the system. And the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her. The merchants, the people who do business, the great powerful merchants have gotten their wealth from her, from participation in this idolatrous system. This was actually happening as early as the time of the 1st century, where Christians were put out of the system and persecuted. A lot of Christians today are seduced and become part of the system because of the monetary benefits. It has big, powerful people in high places in the church have become part of the system. All right, quickly, let me wind up here. Now, here is the message for the church, verses 4 through verse 8. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her. Come out of her." Her who? Out of this Babylonian system. "Come out of her, my people, so you will not take part in her sins." Do you see that? Now, if this was literal Babylon fulfilled in modern Iraq, this makes no sense, would it? Would God be calling Christians out of Iraq? That doesn't make any sense. It's the world political, religious, economic system that Christians are seduced by. This language goes back to the Old Testament, where God calls the people of Israel after the captivity was over to come out of her, to go home to the land. Now, in our times, God calls his people to separate herself from the idolatrous political, economic world system. Come out of her, my people, come out of Babylon. I remember years ago in Jamaica, we were a popular gospel song. Was very festive. The words were like, leave Babylon and come. Some of you remember that. This is where it comes from. It's a call for the church to leave Babylon, to come out of Babylon, to separate herself from Babylon, so that you do not partake of her sins, and so that you will not receive her plagues. What plagues? If Christians, professing Christians, are seduced by this system and do not come out and repent, they are going to come under the same judgment that Babylon comes under. What is the judgment? the plagues. What are the plagues? The plagues of the judgment described in this book of Revelation. That's exactly right. In other words, there are people who are part of the church who have participated in this false and godly world system that God calls to come out, and do not be seduced by it. And this message is not very well heard in the church because the church doesn't proclaim this today, really. We've been so seduced by this system. Yes. And then the judgment is announced, repay her the same way she has repaid others. All right, so this is the primary message for the church in this book. This is the challenge of the book for Christians. It is the ultimate call to obedience we saw earlier on. Those who cooperate with the Babylonian system will lament the judgment because it means their own demise. Later on, you see all the merchants and the great people of the earth, they are wailing and weeping and crying out, woe, woe, for this great city has fallen. If you belong to it, when there's an economic crisis and a crash, if you're part of it, you're going to be saddened. That's right. Because we have cooperated with the system. Those who separate from Babylon should rejoice over judgment, over her judgment, because it means the vindication of their faith and of God's character. Look at verse 20, chapter 18. Rejoice over her, O heavens, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has pronounced judgment against her on your behalf. Do you see that? When the system is judged and it's collapsing, isn't it strange that we're all saddened as Christians because we feel the pinch of it? I do. But you know, this is what the Bible calls us to do, to rejoice. Because what? God has pronounced judgment on this ungodly system and is judging the system. Right? Heaven is rejoicing because God's judgment is just and righteous. I think when I read this, we Christians today have missed it so badly about what the world is about. Chapter 17 and 18, let me conclude, certifies that the final judgment means the destruction of the evil, idolatrous world system, which is at the heart of the human condition, which seduces people and the church away from God. These chapters reveal that the most serious challenge for believers today is the ability to detect and avoid deception by the world system. And I wonder if a huge percentage of the professing church is not so much part of the system. That is why, brothers and sisters, we'll go to war, literally, for defending the system. Christians, these show nonetheless, brothers and sisters, that God will destroy the system because it seeks to do harm to God and to God's people. So chapter 17 and 18 is a further description of the final judgment. God will destroy the world system, both economically, religiously, and politically. And his people rejoice. We are to rejoice because we share God's righteous judgment with him. All right, I have said a whole lot and much more could be said, but I hope it makes sense and that we benefit from this study tonight. God bless you. Back to you, Brother Mario.
All right. I want to thank the Lord, thank our brother Adrian as he shared with us, going through Revelations 8, 17 and 18. Let's see who's on. I'm just going to ask our brother O'Connor to close for us in a word of prayer. then we'll upload the video and it will be on YouTube.